said, "Do you mean to tell me that the Deputy Führer of Germany is in our hands?" And my father said, "Well, that is who he said he was." And Churchill looked at him as though he was having hallucinations and that the war was too much for him. And he said, "Well, Hess or no Hess, I am going to see the Marx Brothers." And they went out to see the film next door.
While Churchill relaxed, Hess was transferred to the military hospital at Buchanan Castle near Loch Lomond. There, Robert Shaw was the young lieutenant in charge of the guard.
Of course, being a kind of aggressive young man who had been trained to kill Germans in the best possible way, I started asking questions. I said, "Why have you come here?" Oh, he said, "You know, it's a great pity you weren't with us in this war, because together we would be able to deal with the Russians." I said, "I'm not concerned about the Russians. I'm concerned about beating the Germans." They said, "You'll never beat us." I said, "Well, yes, we will. We will." When I mentioned the Duke of Hamilton, I said, "Did you know the Duke of Hamilton?" Oh, he said, "I've met him. I met him at the Olympic Games in '36.
Meanwhile, Churchill had ordered Hamilton back to Scotland, together with Yvonne Kirkpatrick of the Foreign Office, who had known Hess well at the British Embassy in Berlin. Shaw was asked to leave while they talked to Hess.
They were there for about 3 hours. And being curious as to what was happening, I had a little shaving mirror, which I put above the door to see what was going on. And it was a very animated conversation. Hess was really quite, not aggressive, but very firm in what he was saying. And this was a very straight talking session between Kirkpatrick and Hess, particularly. And when they came out of the room, the Duke it was said to me, "You know who your prisoner is?" And I said, "Yes." I take it it's Hess. He says, "Yes, it is. You must keep him under observation, personal observation, for the rest of the time that you're here. No one must be allowed to speak to him. And when you leave here in the morning, you must not allow yourself to be interviewed by anyone. This is a very secret conversation that's been going on this evening. Therefore, it must not be repeated anywhere."
The following morning, Shaw had breakfast with Hamilton and Kirkpatrick.
When we were having our meal in the officers' mess, I said to the Duke of Hamilton, "He says he knows you, or he hasn't met you." And the Duke says, "Yes, I did meet him once, and that was in 1936 at the Olympic Games, but we didn't have a friendship."
I'm certain that Hess and my father never met at the Berlin Olympic Games, as some historians have thought. What happened was my father went to the Olympic Games, and he may have been in the same room at the same reception as Hess at the same time on more than one occasion, but they were not introduced to each other, and they did not meet.
News of Hess's flight reached Hitler while he was at his mountain retreat, the Berghof. He flew into a rage. But was his anger directed against Hess or against the very public failure of his mission? Hitler ordered a press statement about Hess broadcast on German radio.
Party member Hess, who has been expressly forbidden by the Führer to use an aeroplane because of a disease which has been getting worse for years, was, in contradiction of this order, able to get hold of a plane recently. A letter which he left behind unfortunately showed traces of mental disturbance, which justifies the fear that Hess was the victim of hallucinations.
But from Britain, there was only silence. Churchill had originally intended to make a statement, but worried that to do so would only magnify the importance of Hess and his peace proposals. Hitler's propaganda chief Goebbels could hardly believe that Britain had failed to exploit Hess's capture. The prisoner had not been paraded for the newspapers and newsreels.
It seems that London has not hit upon the idea of simply issuing statements in Hess's name without his knowledge. This is the big, most alarming danger as far as we are concerned. We are dealing with dumb amateurs over there. What we would do if the situation were reversed.
But if the government was silent, the cartoonists of Fleet Street were determined to have their say. The Duke of Hamilton failed to see the joke in any of this. The absence of any statement from Churchill meant his name remained firmly linked to Hess.
My father waited until he went by taxi from Downing Street to Buckingham Palace, and he shared the taxi with the Prime Minister. And he said, if a prostitute throws her arms around your neck, what do you tell your wife? And Churchill roared with laughter and said not a word to anyone, but he acted. And almost immediately thereafter, a statement was made by Sir Archie Sinclair, which made it clear that my father had not been in correspondence with Hess and had not met him before the war.
The Duke's worry was well-founded, for the Hess mission fueled suspicions on an international scale.
Stalin demanded of all these spies that he had in Britain at the time, like Philby, Burgess, Maclean, Blunt, what's the true story behind Hess's arrival? He was not the only one suspicious. I mean, President Roosevelt was suspicious as well. When he heard about it, a personal briefing from Churchill himself, he said later on to one of his aides, I wonder what the real story is behind Hess's arrival.
You have no idea of the rumors in the press and in Washington and, that Britain was going to make a separate peace, that it was going to collapse and make a deal with Hitler. And of course, a lot of this stuff came from the far left and the communist movement and their agents and so on. But the government was concerned, I am sure.
One of the most intriguing stories appeared in the American Mercury magazine in 1943. It claimed that Hess flew to Britain on Hitler's orders and that a reception committee was waiting for him at the Duke of Hamilton's private airstrip at his home, Dungavel House. It is a story repeated by the latest researchers into the Hess mission. Their information comes from conversations with two former members of the ATS, the British Women's Army, who claimed they were at Dungavel that night.
Mrs. Abbott basically told me that she was in the kitchen with the other girls, part of the service personnel there, and that having a cup of tea. And one of the girls said, oh my goodness, the lights have gone on the airstrip. This was very unusual, because the airstrip was only very, very occasionally used. They went out, and one of them said, this is very obvious for the German bombers if they're coming in. They saw a lot of people coming and going. And somebody said, well, who were all these people? And nobody seemed to know. They'd been on approximately 10, 15 minutes, and the lights were switched off suddenly. They were left in the dark outside, and a few minutes after the lights had gone off, they had an aircraft in the vicinity. And it was a couple of days later that they found that Hess had arrived and bailed out over Eaglesham.
Another Army woman, Mrs. Baker, added more and told of a group of people waiting at some outbuildings known as the Kennels.
She was able to confirm Mrs. Abbott's story that the lights had gone on and off. And she also came up with a story which, frankly, I dismissed initially and indeed had to interrupt her to clarify it, because she explained that the Duke was in the Kennels with his party and with some Polish officers, awaiting the arrival of Hess. I mean, she didn't realise they were awaiting the arrival of Hess until events showed that that was clearly what they were there for. Now, when she said that, I said, well, hold on. I think it's very well established that the Duke was at RAF Turnhouse that evening. So I must challenge you on that. And she said, no, the Duke of Hamilton was at RAF Turnhouse. He was on duty. But the Duke of Kent, I was referring to, he was in the Kennels. Kent was very involved, a very political animal, pro-German, but not pro-Nazi, and certainly a man of peace.
The claim of a welcoming committee ready to receive Hess, though not one with a royal leader, had first been made a few weeks after Hess's flight. In 1941, the Lord Provost of Glasgow, Sir Patrick Dolan, had stated that he had information that Hess had come by arrangement with a British group. He had planned to have peace discussions and would then have flown back with fuel supplied by his hosts.
I think it's just complete fiction and not based on hard evidence. What happened was more astonishing than fiction in many respects, and it gave rise to many extraordinary stories.
However, Hess clearly thought he would be met by a powerful delegation. Stalin believed he had fallen into a trap prepared by British intelligence. fed with false hopes and lured to Scotland.
Far from, as some historians have said, SAS lured Hess over here. What was the purpose of luring him over here if you then didn't make a publicity coup out of it? You know, Hitler balmy says Deputy Führer who's just fled to Britain. But there was no purpose in luring him here, whereas there was obviously lots of things to be gained by inviting him here. Invite him here, introduce him to all these pro-German and pro-Nazi establishment people, and out of that they hoped that a compromise peace would emerge.
As a young man, Pat Morse served as aide to General Bill Donovan, head of American Special Operations, the OSS.
For him to have suddenly decided, maybe on a whim, I guess I'll go down to the airport and hop in a two-seater plane and run off to England and land over there and get in touch with the local gentry and say, take me to your leader, I want to talk about a peace plan between Great Britain and Germany. It just is not reasonable. That leaves me with the conclusion that necessarily this was a designed effort in order to reach an accommodation between the two countries to head off further hostilities.
I interviewed Sir Dick White, the head of British Secret Intelligence Service in the late 80s, and he'd been an intelligence officer during the war and he knew the whole Hess story back to front. I put to him my theory that Hess had been invited and he smiled enigmatically, but he didn't deny it. And he was the one who sowed the idea in my mind that the problem for the Germans about Hess was that Hess had arrived too late and that Churchill had swung the nation, including all these establishment dissidents, behind the war effort. So he said, poor old Hess, he arrived too late.
In Germany, Hess's photograph was removed from public display and his name deleted from all Nazi publications. His wife and son were also under pressure from his successor, Martin Bormann.
After the flight, Martin Bormann tried to damage our family and to kick us out of the house in Munich. And then my mother received a letter from Eva Braun saying, if you need anything, please inform me because I'm talking to Hitler without Bormann. Very interesting sentence, huh?
Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess had been moved to Mendiff Court in Wales. Here he had a degree of freedom, visited the village pubs, and according to local folklore may even have signed this beer label. As a young girl, Eve Criddle lived in a nearby house.
I was only 4 years of age. We arrived by car. As we stopped to go into the gate, what I particularly remembered, all these soldiers appearing with rifles. And Hess came out of the door with a soldier each side. And Hess was a head taller than the soldiers. He was very tall. And Hess walked down the path towards the lodge and then on into the garden. As he passed me, he half smiled. And on he went. And just wandered around the garden. I saw him wander around the garden a few times after that. My father said, I want you to remember that man. And then, of course, years after the war, he had to confess it was Hess.
Hess remained in Wales until the end of the war. For 4 years, he had been kept from public view, never photographed, never interviewed. Then, in 1945, he was back on the front page as he stood trial for war crimes with his former colleagues at Nuremberg.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. 9. That will be entered as not guilty.
I was as close to Hess when I was going in connection with presenting our briefs to Hess as I am to you. Hess was a composed figure, unlike what has been often portrayed as a flaky guy who was off the wall. There was no evidence of that. He was aware of what was going on.
Throughout the trial, Hess had claimed to be suffering from amnesia. He said he didn't recognize Goering or Bulla, who had translated the letter to Hamilton, or his old mentor, Karl Haushofer. A panel of psychiatrists was set up to examine Hess. One man who was deeply suspicious of Hess's amnesia was Alan Dulles. Dulles had been in charge of United States intelligence gathering from inside Germany and would soon become director of the CIA. He had a more sensational explanation to offer. He said he had reason to believe that Hess had been secretly executed on Churchill's orders and that the man in the dock was an impostor. There was a way of proving this. Hess must be examined to see if he bore the mark of the bullet wound he suffered in the First World War. However, Hess's guards refused to allow the examination to take place. Hess was found not guilty of war crimes, but was sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau Prison in Berlin. It was here in 1973 that an Army surgeon, Dr. Hugh Thomas, managed to perform the examination which had eluded Dulles. He noted that the prisoner bore no scars on his chest that would correspond to the bullet wound suffered in the First World War, and X-rays of his lungs showed no trace of the passage of a bullet. He concluded that the man in Spandau was not Rudolf Hess. Hugh Thomas believes that the real Hess was murdered and it was a double who flew to Britain. Like Thomas, Stephen Pryor and his team believe that a double existed. They're convinced that Hess ended his mission where it had begun, in Scotland. During the war, there had been persistent rumors linking Hess to Scotland. Churchill had been forced to deny that he was being held prisoner there in response to questions asked in Parliament. And in 1942, SS intelligence located Hess at a villa in Scotland.
When I subsequently spoke to the late Lord Thurso about it, he also said this was common currency, common parlance at the time. He had no knowledge of it, but his mother had told him there was the rumour. Now, that was only 9 miles away from where they lived, the Braemore Lodge, from where the Thursos lived.
But how could Hess be in Scotland while being held at Mendef Court in Wales? Pryor believes that a double lived at the lightly guarded Mendef while the real Hess was secure in Scotland, and that it was here that Hess's path once again crossed that of the Duke of Kent, with devastating results. The Duke of Kent was the King's brother and the only member of the royal family to die in active service during the Second World War. His memorial is a simple stone cross amid the isolated mountains of Caithness at the northern tip of Scotland. Kent died when a Sunderland flying boat in which he was a passenger crashed into these Scottish mountains in the summer of 1942. He was supposedly en route to Iceland. But while Kent took off at 1:10 in the afternoon, the crash was not recorded as having happened until 2 o'clock, nearly an hour, when the distance traveled would only have involved a flying time of 20 minutes. The official report gave the cause of the accident as the aircraft having deviated from its official flight path and flying too low. But where were Kent and the Sunderland crew during the missing 30 to 40 minutes?
In order to explain the missing 30 to 40 minutes and to explain where he crashed, we've got to find somewhere that he can have landed. Now, the only place that we've got here, and strangely enough it is owned by the then Minister of Air, Sir Archibald Sinclair, is Loch Moor.
Pryor and his team believed that the Sunderland was off course because it had landed to pick up Hess, who was waiting for them in a cottage at the edge of Loch Moor. They say the plan was to take him to neutral Sweden. The flying boat flew a course designed to avoid surrounding high peaks, but narrowly failed to clear the mountain barrier at the far end of the loch and crashed on Eagles Rock. There were 15 passengers and crew on board the plane. After the crash, an RAF team removed the bodies and the Air Ministry reported no survivors. But the following day, one of the crew, the tail gunner, Andy Jack, staggered to a farmer's cottage, having spent the night on the moors. His survival meant there had been 16 on board.
And the question then is Hess the extra body on the Sunderland?
Wolf Hess still lives today in the village which was his father's mountain retreat. He rejects all theories that suggest the man in Spandau was not his father.
It's very clear for me that my father flew personally to Britain or to Scotland, and he's the man who was in Nuremberg and in Spandau, and all the other theories are nonsense.
Spandau's prisoner number 7 refused visits from his family until 1969, 28 years after he'd said goodbye and flown off. But even then, any mention of his peace mission was forbidden.
Never ever I was allowed to discuss these things with my father, because the time between 33 and 45 were completely off the record in Spandau.
Why was that?
I don't know, you have to ask the Allies.
The visits continued until August 17, 1987. Rudolf Hess was found dead in his cell. He had apparently committed suicide by hanging, by tying a piece of electrical cord around his neck, knotting it to a window frame, and then falling off his chair. His death did not end the mystery. It merely deepened it. A month earlier, the German magazine Der Spiegel had claimed he was prepared to tell all he knew. To this day, Wolf Hess is convinced his father was murdered.
You know, we made the family ask for a second autopsy, which was carried out in Munich by the very well-known pathologist Professor Spann. And he made pictures of his autopsy. And the pictures, I think the best is if you look at them, and then you can see that there's a completely horizontal mark on the neck, and this doesn't fit into the official version that he hanged himself, because then the marks have to go to a certain point up.
The combination of official secrecy, the real doubts about just how he died, and the profusion of conspiracy theories have only served to obscure the real purpose of the Hess mission.
There was a mystery about Hess that exists to this day. The arguments on both sides on such questions as whether were there two Rudolf Hesses, did the real one die in Spandau, was the real one spirited off somewhere else, and why was Hess never permitted to be interviewed? Why was he sealed up in a prison for years and years and years when he really had quite a story to tell? Here was a blockbuster of a story.
I don't think we'll ever know the whole truth about the Hess affair, because some of the files are not ordinary Foreign Office files, but British Secret Intelligence Service files, which are exempt from any Freedom of Information Act. And I don't think British Secret Service is ever going to be prepared to admit that the whole Hess affair was an operation that went wrong.
Among the theories and misinformation, it's possible to glimpse flashes of the truth. Hess flew to Britain believing he would be greeted by a group of people willing to talk peace. His mission may have been a wild throw of the dice, but it was the final throw, not the first. He went to his grave never having revealed the contents of that last conversation with Adolf Hitler, or of why he was so convinced of being greeted by sympathetic Britons. Perhaps that is why he could never be released. Spandau's prisoner number 7 was the man who knew too much.